Welcome to the 13th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, Okinawa, World War II's Typhoon of Steel. The final battle before the anticipated invasion of mainland Japan, Okinawa became the deadliest battle for U.S. forces in the Pacific, with savage fighting on land, air, and especially at sea. Nicknamed the Typhoon of Steel because of its intense artillery fire and bombardments, the battle for Okinawa claimed 49,000 U.S. casualties, including more than 12,000 deaths. For the Japanese soldiers, the battle for Okinawa was far worse, with 90,000 deaths. As always, civilians suffered the most, with an estimated 150,000 dead. William Agen recalled the terror of kamikaze attacks that occurred 3 or 4 times during the day and oftener at night. Raymond, Goron, and Klenman both lost their best friends in kamikaze attacks. 23 servicemen received the Medal of Honor for their heroism in Okinawa. This podcast includes the stories of 6 Medal of Honor recipients. Kamikazes set the LCS that Richard M. McCool commanded ablaze and resulted in 50% casualties among his crew, yet McCool still managed to rescue some 98 men from a sinking destroyer. Richard E. Bush threw himself on a grenade to save the wounded men in his squad. Elsewhere, a wounded Robert E. Bush gave his lieutenant a life-saving transfusion of plasma with his one hand while he used his other to fire his pistol at the advancing Japanese who were less than 30 feet away. Angry that the Japanese had his riflemen pinned down for far too long on Hen Hill, Clarence Craft led a heroic attack against the Japanese defensive line, killing an estimated 25 Japanese soldiers. Atop the 400-foot Maeda Escarpment, conscientious objector Desmond T rescued an estimated 75 soldiers, lowering them 35 feet below the escarpment in a rope-supported litter tied to a tree stump, all the while under enemy fire as he did so. While the bloody battle for Okinawa raged on, Staff Sergeant Henry E. Red Erwin was flying bombing runs over the Japanese mainland. On a mission to bomb a chemical plant, the phosphorus smoke bomb Erwin was supposed to drop to signal to B-29s that they had reached their target exploded prematurely in the launching chute, shooting its 1,300-degree Fahrenheit flames into the aircraft, and more precisely, into Erwin's face. Those stories and more in this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in their reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught, so to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. Like Iwo Jima before it, the 100,000 Japanese soldiers under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's command at Okinawa waited for the 172,000 American invasion force to come to them before they struck. At approximately 66 miles long and 8 miles wide, Okinawa was considered the last defensive fortress before the Japanese mainland, which lie 330 miles northeast. Under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, the Americans met little resistance as they stormed the island's west coast early on April 1, 1945, securing their primary objectives, the island's 2 airstrips, within the first 3 hours. But the initial ease of the American landing soon gave way to some of the most ferocious fighting of the Pacific theater. The Japanese defensive line plan relied heavily on kamikaze pilots, who pledged to wipe out the U.S. fleet. Cut off from reinforcements and supplies, the Japanese would then destroy the American forces. The Japanese defensive lines were concentrated on 3 of the island's southernmost mountain ridges, near Shuri, a 13th century castle town. Lieutenant General Ushijima's forces were entrenched in interconnecting caves and tunnels throughout the ridges of Kakazu, Nishibaru, and Tanabaru, all of which became major battlegrounds. William J. Agen, a first-class petty officer aboard the U.S. Hikuriha, a fleet ocean tug armed with both 40mm and 20mm AA gun mounts, recalled the terror of kamikaze attacks inflicted on naval operations in Okinawa Bay. 3 suicide planes came from nowhere, day and night. There were never more than 2 or 3 of them at a time, but when they started diving at their target, the only way to stop them was to blast them out of the sky. Most of the time, these planes hit the target they aimed at. Seldom, if ever, could they sink a ship, but the damage and loss of life they could create was terrible. During the peak of the kamikaze attacks, they might occur 3 or 4 times during the day, and oftener during the night, according to Agen. In an attempt to deter the attacks, many ships were equipped with smoke makers that covered everything with a thick cloud of smoke. Agen wasn't too sure if the smoke makers didn't help the Japanese kamikazes more than the American fleet that they were supposed to protect. He wrote, "I don't know if this was a good or bad, as with the smoke cover, you couldn't see the plane until it was right upon you." Every naval sailor and officer knew that the kamikaze pilots were hell-bent on murdering as many of them as they could on their suicide missions. Agen recalled first came the eerie whine of the kamikaze as it went into its dive. Then, you would stand and wonder if your ship was the one it was headed for. While the average Japanese pilot had an estimated 3% chance of hitting his target, kamikazes were considerably deadlier and had a success rate of 15 to 20%. To maximize their destructive power, kamikazes were bursting with high-powered explosives, up to 2 tons. But Agen believed the terror the kamikazes struck in the hearts of the Allied Navy had an even greater impact than the destruction they wrought. "I suppose the main purpose of this type of warfare, as far as the Japanese were concerned, was the psychological effect it had on the morale of the officers and men on board the ships in Okinawa Bay, and believe me, an effect it did have." After evacuating and treating the injured at Iwo Jima and the Solomon Islands, the hospital ship that Raymond C. Goron was assigned to anchored next at Okinawa, rescuing the wounded there. Even the hospital ship was not immune to kamikaze attacks, as Goron recalled. "Early on the 4th day, 7 kamikaze planes appeared from low-hanging clouds. 3 planes passed over our ship, and the 4th one clammed into our control tower. The engine left the plane and struck out the front porthole. Extra gasoline on plane ignited the entire superstructure. The planes returned, and our remaining guns shot down 3 of the planes, and the remainder were hit by the surrounding ships." The kamikaze attack killed 7 and wounded 30 on Goron's ship, which was so badly damaged it had to be sent back to Hawaii. Amongst the dead was Goron's close buddy. "My friend was killed," Goron recalled. "Instead of jumping in the water, he tried to run down a flaming staircase. He never made it." Burials of all 7 of the men were held at sea, since there was no way to keep the bodies on board. Although he was never far from death, caring for so many gravely injured soldiers, Goron found that he lost his fear of death during the war. "Life is too short to worry about anything," he concluded. "After all the deaths that I witnessed, I know God has something better planned for us." The U.S. Navy had 1,457 ships involved in the battle for Okinawa. 36 were sunk, and 368 were severely damaged. The fighting was so intense at sea that more U.S. soldiers were killed around Okinawa than on the island itself. 5,000 were killed, and another 4,800 were casualties. Even more soldiers would have been lost at sea had it not been for Richard M. McCool, Jr., of Bainbridge Island, Washington, the commander of an LCS ship. McCool's ship may have looked like a landing craft, but instead of carrying soldiers, its crew of 70 manned 40mm and 20mm guns, as well as 50 caliber machine guns and 120 4.5-inch rockets. On the nights of June 10th and 11th, 1945, McCool was part of a kamikaze lookout patrol, consisting of 4 LCS ships and 3 destroyers. The patrol shot down as many kamikaze planes as they could. When one got through and struck a destroyer on June 10th, McCool's LCS came to the sinking ship's aid. "Our ship's log listed 98 men that we took off the USS William D. Porter, but there may have been a few more who did not get counted at the time," McCool wrote in August of 2000. But the following evening, it was McCool's own ship that became the target of a vicious kamikaze attack. "The attacking kamikaze planes the next day would have had to go past my ship, the USS LCS L-3-122, to get to the larger destroyers to the south of us, and so they attacked us instead. The first one passed just a few feet over our number 1 gun mount and crashed into the ocean. I am pretty sure that we hit that plane. The second came just behind it and crashed into the conning tower just a few feet below where I was standing." The LCS was now engulfed in flames. Several of its crew members were trapped in compartments completely ablaze. "The fires were generally in the immediate area of the crash and on the port side of the deck house where the bombing finally exploded, apparently having been armed with some sort of delayed action fuse." Although suffering from severe burns as well as bomb fragment wounds on his left side, McCool rallied his crew to extinguish the fires as best as they could. McCool personally ran into the burning compartments to rescue his trapped crew members, carrying one man to safety. Recalling the damage that kamikazes wrought on his ship, McCool wrote, "We had 12 people killed and 23 more wounded, which meant we had about 50% casualties." McCool continued his efforts to save as many of his crew members as he could until other naval ships arrived, offering their assistance and evacuating McCool to a hospital ship. For his courageous leadership under kamikaze attack, McCool received the Medal of Honor. McCool was one of 23 men who earned the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award, at Okinawa. Over half of those men, 14 to be exact, were given the medal posthumously. The 61% of men given the medal posthumously at Okinawa is reflective of the medal as a whole. Of the 464 soldiers who received the Medal of Honor for their service in World War II, 266 of them, or 57%, were awarded posthumously. Phil Klenman served on the USS Ralph Talbot, a naval destroyer. The Ralph Talbot was credited with destroying 26 Japanese planes, including 4 kamikaze planes, expending 500 tons of explosive shells and torpedoes into Japanese cruisers, destroyers, and smaller vessels. The Ralph Talbot chalked up so many kills that Admiral Halsey himself once signaled the ship and asked, "Have you fellas no regard for the bag limit?" Klenman performed anti-submarine warfare on the Talbot. After the war, he published a quarterly newsletter for more than 25 years for his surviving shipmates, and he became a historian of the USS Ralph Talbot. He wrote, "We participated in about 16 campaigns and 14 major engagements, from Savo Island, Guadalcanal, to Okinawa, and finally to the occupation of Japan in Shashko, Japan, capturing Iwo Jima. We were in full view of the raising of the USS flag on Mount Suribachi. We were in the Philippines invasion, the New Guinea invasion, Okinawa, and finally the Japanese occupation. At Okinawa, we were hit by a kamikaze plane. We lost 8 men, and we sustained serious damage." 2 of the men killed in the kamikaze attack were members of Klenman's gang of close buddies. The kamikazes devastated part of the ship. Klenman recalled the aftermath of the kamikaze attack. "We had temporary repairs at a forward base, and we stayed to complete the war. We were shelled, torpedoed, had several night battles in which we lost quite a number of fleet and kamikazed." Night battles were the most frightening for Klenman. "Because of darkness, we couldn't easily detect the incoming attack until it struck, if it did." With the constant threat of kamikaze attacks, the fighting at Okinawa was intense at sea, but it was even more savage on the island itself. Japanese defenses in Okinawa were formidable, with cave systems dug 50 feet below the ground. Fighting was so ferocious that the 4th Marines, who landed on the island with 3,275 men, suffered 3,106 casualties, for a mind-boggling casualty rate of 91%. When he was a 21-year-old corporal, Richard E. Bush of Waukegan, Illinois, led a final assault on Okinawa's Mount Itekiteki. As Japanese artillery beat down on him, Bush managed to lead his squad up the fosse of the rocky precipice, sweep over the ridge, and drive the defending troops from their deeply entrenched position, according to his citation for the Medal of Honor. Seriously wounded in the action, Bush was pulled into the relative safety of some rocks, where a medic treated his injuries. When a hand grenade was thrown at the wounded men, Bush unhesitantly pulled the deadly missile to himself, and he absorbed the shattering violence of the exploding charge in his own body, thereby saving his fellow Marines from severe injury or death, despite the certain peril to his own life. Bush was lucky to survive the blast, but he lost several fingers and an eye. In a 1998 letter, he joked, "I still have enough metal in me to shoe a horse." Bush would receive the Medal of Honor from President Truman for his bravery on October 5, 1945. At Okinawa, there was a second Bush, unrelated to Richard, who would also receive the nation's most distinguished military medal. Robert E. Bush of Olympia, Washington, had been just 17 when his mother gave him special permission to join the Navy. Bush wanted to serve as a medic because he had grown up in the basement of the 30-bed hospital his single mom worked at in Raymond, Washington. In an interview with journalist Tom Brokaw, Bush recalled reassuring his mother after enlisting, "Mom, I'm going into the service to help people, not to kill them." There is no shortage of American boys for Robert Bush to help at Okinawa, with many companies having casualty rates of 90% or higher. On a soggy, wet May 2, 1945, Bush went along with the 1st Marine Division as they were ordered to capture a heavily fortified ridge. As Japanese mortar and small arms fire rained down on them, Bush found himself in the fiercest fighting he had experienced yet. He desperately tried to save as many of the brave young Marines falling all around him as he could. Amidst the chaos, the company's lieutenant, James Roach, was shot in the chest as he led his company up the hill. Although Lieutenant Roach was completely exposed to enemy fire, Bush did not hesitate to run to his side. As he gave Lieutenant Roach a life-saving transfusion of plasma with his one hand, he used his other to fire his pistol at the advancing Japanese, who were now less than 30 feet away. When he ran out of ammunition, Bush discarded the pistol and used Lieutenant Roach's carbine. Bush continued firing, killing several Japanese soldiers. In a 1998 letter to the author, Bush recalled the battle. During that type of an encounter, the thinking time is almost none. You react to your training, and the training I received was that you never turn your back on the Japanese. By not turning my back, I was able to not only get Roach out, but to get myself out too. As Bush continued firing at the Japanese, even as he administered life-saving aid to Lieutenant Roach, another Marine soon arrived at his side. Bush told him to evacuate the gravely injured Lieutenant Roach further down the hill. Just after they left, a Japanese soldier lobbed a grenade at Bush, blinding him in the right eye. 2 more grenades soon followed, filling Bush with shrapnel. Gravely injured now himself, Bush knew his only chance was to get down the hill. Never turning his back on the Japanese, Bush instead used his one good eye to get around the hill. He stumbled upon a Japanese machine gun nest, surprised the 3 soldiers manning its guns, and killed them both with a single shot. Somehow, miraculously, Bush managed to get back down the hill. Exhausted and bleeding, Bush resumed his care for the wounded and refused medical attention for himself until the battle had ended. Medics were too valuable, and there were too many casualties to expect a medic, or corpsman, as they were often called, to risk their life to save a single life, especially if it appeared in doing so they themselves would become casualties. Robert Bush's actions were even more remarkable considering his feelings towards Lieutenant Roach. Although Lieutenant Roach survived the encounter, Bush wrote in his 1998 letter, "I was not close with him after the war because I felt he had made a bad decision that day, and although I had put it out of my own thoughts this far down the road, it did cost lives which needn't have been lost. I wasn't very happy about that." Bush had received his $1 million wound, and then some. He was sent back to the U.S., first to Hawaii to receive care for his injuries, then finally back to Washington, where he married his high school sweetheart, Wanda. The 2 of them celebrated their honeymoon with a trip to Washington, D.C., where Bush received the Congressional Medal of Honor from President Truman himself. 4 weeks after Robert E. Bush's brave rescue of Lieutenant Roach, Clarence B. Craft of Fayetteville, Arkansas, led an attack on May 31, 1945, on Hen Hill in Okinawa, which served as a strategic center of the Japanese line of defense. For 12 days, American GIs had been pinned down, suffering heavy casualties as they tried to take the hill. Craft, a private first class with Company G of the 2nd Battalion of the 382nd Infantry, 96th Infantry Division, was angry that so many of his buddies were being shot down as they tried in vain to penetrate the Japanese defenses. In a 1999 letter, Craft described his thinking at the time. "I was mad at the Japanese, and we had been pinned down too long. The United States Army trains men to handle themselves in such matters. Without good training, I would not have survived." Not much of the Japanese defensive line on Hen Hill survived after Craft led his courageous charge. Accompanied by 5 soldiers, Craft was sent as a forward scout and frontline rifleman in advance of his company to test the enemy resistance. Moving out in a diamond formation, the group immediately drew fire from Japanese machine guns and grenades. 3 of the 5 men were injured. Driven by his anger and fright, Craft wrote, "Anybody that isn't frightened in a situation like that is nuts." Craft went on a one-man attack. According to his Medal of Honor citation, he stood up in full view of the enemy and began shooting with deadly marksmanship wherever he saw a hostile movement. He steadily advanced up the hill, killing Japanese soldiers with rapid fire, driving others to cover in their strongly disposed trenches, unhesitatingly facing alone the strength that had previously beaten back attacks of battalion strength. Standing atop Hen Hill, Craft was running out of everything. "The other men that was left in my squad, well, they helped me, passing me grenades and satchel charges up from the base of the cliff," Craft wrote in a 1999 letter. He also directed his comrades on where to throw their grenades. Adrenaline pumping, Craft fought on, charging up the main enemy trench. His citation described what happened next. Straddling the excavation, he pumped rifle fire into the Japanese at point-blank range, killing many and causing the others to flee down the trench. Pursuing them, he came upon a heavy machine gun, which was still creating havoc in the American ranks. With rifle fire and a grenade, he wiped out this position. By this time, the Japanese were in complete rout, and American forces were swarming over the hill. Craft followed the retreating enemy to the mouth of a cave. There he tossed a satchel charge into the cave, sealing the enemy in what became their tomb. Craft's attack had a far-reaching consequence for Hen Hill, was the key to the entire defensive line, which rapidly crumbled after his utterly fearless and heroic attack. In all, Craft killed an estimated 25 enemy soldiers. Afterwards, he soon came down with typhoid, and he had to be evacuated by hospital ship to Guam. "It was there that I learned of being put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor," he wrote. Later, Craft would also fight in the Korean War before he became a 100% disabled veteran. He spent his last years volunteering at the VA hospital, where he himself went for psychiatric treatment after he suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome. Although he received lots of recognition for his war heroism, having both a park in his hometown and, in addition to the VA hospital in Fayetteville, Arkansas, named in his honor, Craft admitted, "I would really like to forget. I just had a job to do. I was in the right place at the right time. I just lucked out." For the 75 soldiers, he later insisted it was closer to 50, whose lives Private Desmond T. Das rescued atop the 400-foot-high Maeda Escarpment during the Battle of Okinawa, there was no question that Das was definitely the right man to be in the inferno that was at Okinawa at the right time. Private Das was a combat medic with the 307th Infantry, 77th Infantry Division, and a conscientious objector who refused to handle a gun when he rescued one wounded soldier after another, lowering them 35 feet below the escarpment in a rope-supported litter tied to a tree stump, all the while under enemy fire as he did so. While his actions in Okinawa were nothing short of miraculous, the soldiers of his platoon could be excused for coming to expect such heroism from the deeply religious Seventh-day Adventist. Before Okinawa, Private Das had already received a Bronze Star for his battlefield medic heroics at Guam and at Leyte in the Philippines. For Das, all the glory went to God. He wrote in a May 1st, 2000 letter, "I'm sure the Lord especially protected us." Previously, he told the Richmond Times-Dispatch in 1998, "All the glory should go to God. No telling how many times the Lord has spared my life." There is no disputing that because of Das, countless wounded soldiers stranded on the Maeda Escarpment were given a second chance of life, lowered off the escarpment where they could receive medical attention below. For Das, his work as a combat medic was a manifestation of his faith and his love for his fellow man. The men Das rescued and those he served with were used to Das sharing his faith with them, though he never argued about it. Das described his evangelism in a letter written in 2000. "In fact, I was nicknamed Doc and Preacher because I enjoyed reading my Bible and getting the strength I needed to do God's will." When he himself was injured by a grenade a few weeks after the battle for Maeda Escarpment, Das waved off medics, not wanting them to risk their own lives, while he cared for his own injuries for 5 hours. When a medic finally carried him off the battlefield on a litter, Das rolled off when he saw a soldier worse off than himself, insisting the medics attend to the more injured man first. Das had never met the man before, nor did he ever see him again. For Das, his selflessness was a manifestation of his favorite biblical verse, Revelations 22:14. "Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have a right to the tree of life, and may enter in through the gates into the city." Shortly after giving up his spot on the litter for the more injured man, Das was struck by Japanese fire, fracturing his arm. It was only then that he handled a weapon for his one and only time during the war. He made a splint from a rifle stock and crept to the aid station 300 yards away. Das became the first conscientious objector to ever receive the Medal of Honor, which was presented to him by President Truman on October 12, 1945. To this day, only one other conscientious objector has ever received the nation's highest military honor. Colonel Thomas W. Bennett received the award posthumously for his service as an Army medic in Vietnam. Desmond T. Das wrote in his 2000 letter, "The important thing is to live up to what you believe is right." There was never any doubt that Das did that and much, much more. Although Das had to fight to obtain his conscientious objector's status based on his faith as a Seventh-day Adventist, Das demonstrated time and again that his service in the name of the God he loved was invaluable to the war effort. In the final days of the battle for Okinawa, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, the commander of the Allied invasion force, was killed himself while visiting an observation post near Mizado Ridge. As he watched the 8th Marine Regiment on the battlefield, 5 anti-tank shells exploded nearby him, striking him in the chest with deadly shrapnel. Buckner was soon followed in death by the Japanese generals Ushijima and Cho, who both committed harikiri, allowing themselves to be decapitated and disemboweled on the final day of the battle, June 22nd. It seemed the furnace of Okinawa spared no one. Okinawa had become the costliest battle in the Pacific Theater. During the 83-day battle, 110,000 Japanese were killed and another 10,755 were taken prisoner. Over 900 kamikaze planes were sacrificed as they sank 36 U.S. Navy ships and damaged another 368. The battle cost the U.S. Army and the Marines 7,613 killed and the Navy nearly 5,000 dead. The U.S. invasion suffered over 58,000 casualties. Japan now knew that the Americans were at their doorstep. The war was lost. It was only a matter of time. But the Japanese planned to make it as costly as possible for the Americans so that they might be granted more favorable terms for peace than an unconditional surrender. Meanwhile, the U.S. steeled itself for the bloody battle for the Japanese mainland, which its generals now predicted would cost an estimated 250,000 American lives. While the bloody battle for Okinawa raged on, Staff Sergeant Henry E. Red Erwin of Adamsville, Alabama, was flying bombing runs over the Japanese mainland. Erwin served with the 52nd Bombardment Squadron, 29th Bombardment Wing, on a B-29 nicknamed the Snatch Blatch and piloted by Captain George Cimarron. Erwin recalled his duties as radio operator of the B-29. My responsibilities were sending and receiving messages from Northfield, our home base on Guam. We used Morse code and a Latin lamp to communicate. The Snatch Blatch participated in the firebombing of Tokyo, along with some 330 B-29 bombers on March 10, 1945. The bombs that spewed out of its hulls were responsible for killing an estimated 120,000 people, nearly all of whom were civilians. Because they were made of napalm and thermite, Tokyo erupted in an inferno that engulfed 16 square miles of the city. 1 month after that firebombing, on April 12, 1945, Erwin was on another mission to a chemical plant near Koriyama, Japan, to bomb its factories. Because the Snatch Blanche was in the lead position, Erwin was supposed to drop phosphorus smoke bombs when the B-29s reached their launching point to help assemble the rest of the group. One phosphorus bomb exploded prematurely in the launching chute, shooting its 1,300-degree Fahrenheit flames into the aircraft, and more precisely, into Erwin's face, blinding him and destroying his nose. The B-29 went into a dive as smoke and flames filled the craft. Erwin somehow picked up the burning phosphorus bomb and crawled towards the co-pilot's window. Although he was now completely ablaze, Erwin staggered into the cockpit, shouting, "Open the window! Open the window!" and hurled the burning bomb out of the aircraft, allowing the pilot to pull the B-29 out of its nosedive. Quickly, the rest of the crew used their fire extinguishers to douse the flames that covered Erwin. When the B-29 made its emergency landing in Iwo Jima, Erwin was rushed to a hospital where, despite the doctor's best efforts, he wasn't expected to live. General Curtis LeMay learned of Erwin's heroic actions the next day and immediately recommended him for a Medal of Honor. However, there was only one such medal in all of the Pacific. No one thought the severely burned radio operator would live long, so there was considerable urgency in finding the medal, which Erwin described in a letter written in 2000. There was one Medal of Honor medal in the Pacific area at George Richardson's headquarters. General LeMay, our commanding officer, ordered a B-29 to go get that medal and return it to the Fleet Hospital 103. It was presented to me on April 19, 1945. As his crew gathered around him, Erwin appeared like a living mummy, wrapped entirely in white bandages, with only his eyes and lips appearing through slits. Even so, he managed to mutter, "Thank you, sir," as General LeMay presented him with the award. When he wrote his 2000th letter, Erwin was still recovering from a stroke that he had suffered in 1995. But he was undaunted. After all, he had previously recovered from 41 surgeries to rebuild his face, his vision, and his body after his ill-fated B-29 mission.
If only one little wish that I wish comes true, I know that the angels will watch over you.
The song, Good Night Wherever You Are, was written by Al Hoffman, Dick Robertson, and Frank Weldon, and sung by the incomparable Vera Lynn. If you liked this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network you use. Check out the companion book on Amazon.com. Follow our podcasts and tell your friends. Check out our website for additional information on the veterans that were discussed in this episode and pictures of them. New episodes come out bi-weekly. You can find our companion book on Amazon.com. And until next time, thank you for remembering our World War II veterans.